And we're live for the Integralist Localist Roundtable. I'm here with Gideon and Connor. Guys, how you doing?
Fantastic. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I've been a long-time fan of this podcast, so it's great to finally talk with you guys over it.
Oh, yeah, we're happy to have you on. Really excited for this one, guys. It's going to be fun. So I think we've covered integral. We on this channel, we've done explaining like on 5 integralism and localism. But in case anyone is new, because they're not super well known, Gideon, if you could just give us a quick like 5-minute breakdown of integralism, and then I'll have Connor do a quick 5-minute breakdown of localism, and then we'll get into discussing.
Yeah, so the basics of integralism, or some people pronounce it as integralism, I'm not sure which is actually the right one, but the essential idea is that there should be an integral unity between the church and the state. And this isn't to say that the church should stop existing and all the religious functions should be run by the state, or vice versa, where the church actually starts running the government. It's still an important fact that the two are really distinct authorities. But that these two really distinct authorities, they take care of man in his two different ends. So man has a natural end. And however, there's different views within Catholic theology on how strictly there is a distinct natural end. I'm of the opinion that there's not as strict of a distinct of a natural end as some people make it out to be. But the central idea essentially is that there's clearly some sort of end man has within this natural world. And the goal of the state is to ensure the common good in this life, versus the goal of the church is to orient us towards heaven. And so they have two really distinct ends that they're dealing with, but the two ends intertwine because it's here during this life, in this earthly journey, that we also have to grow spiritually and orient ourselves towards heaven. I think there's sort of two main lines of approach you can use for arguing for integralism, or maybe 3, I might say. The first one is just, it's taught by the church. You can find it in lots and lots of papal encyclicals, such as Immortali Dei by Leo XIII, but it's also not just there. If you look at Vatican II in Dignitas Humanae, it talks about at the beginning there that this encyclical is not at all meant to overturn church teaching, traditional church teaching on the matter, and it's not meant to relieve the civil society of its duty towards the true faith. Rather, all Dignitatis Humanae is doing is ensuring that people have religious freedom. So we can recognize a growing sense of religious freedom, while at the same time saying this church teaching has not in fact changed. The second approach, I think, is the philosophical argument that if we look at the different relations man has, right? Man has a relation towards himself, towards his neighbor, towards his family, towards his state. Man is constituted of all these sorts of duties of justice. But man also has a duty of justice towards God as well. And this is fulfilled by the virtue of religion. We often collapse today religion and faith into the same thing. But really, if you look at St. Thomas's treatment, for example, these are two very different virtues. Religion is in the will, and it's a natural virtue, versus faith is in the intellect, and it's a supernatural virtue. So really, they're very different virtues. What religion is our orientation towards God, our giving God what is due. St. Thomas, for example, quotes the verse in the Psalms of, what will I give back to the Lord for all that he has given to me? God has given us our very existence. This can be proven even by nature. And so even by nature, we owe a duty towards God. And so then I think we have to search out of what is the true religion. And ultimately then, Catholicism gives us the true and proper way to worship God supernaturally. And so this is the natural obligation of the state. The third argument I would give would be theological in nature, where I think if you look at the biblical narrative, the entire purpose of God instituting governments among mankind, it's not because of some sort of state of nature, right? Adam and Eve start in a state of peace in the garden. But fundamentally, the city, the political, is ultimately fulfilled in the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. So all these different political entities throughout Scripture, there's good ones and bad ones, right? So we have sort of the city of Enoch, founded by Cain in the beginning of the Bible. We have Babel. These are sort of two prototypical examples of evil cities. But Jerusalem is supposed to sort of be the prototypical good city, which has this whole war in scripture against these two cities, one against the other. But ultimately, I think if we look in a greater theological picture, the whole reason that God created the world is for the sake of the incarnation. You can find this in the Catechism in paragraph 280, that God made the world for the sake of Christ and the new creation. So it's Christ and Christ as king over the political in the New Jerusalem. And so I think integralism is essentially moving the political forward towards the eschaton, and that the ultimate purpose of the political is actually religious in nature. And so you can't have really, I think, a secular politics.
No, I would agree with that. On the whole theological point of the argument, it reminds me, was it St. Robert Bellarmine who made the two swords argument, that when Christ told Peter to put away his sword, he shouldn't have a sword, but it wasn't his sword to use, in the sense that he had the spiritual sword while it was also the temporal sword. I think I'm pretty sure that was St. Robert Bellarmine. I could be mistaken on who made that argument, but eventually I would love to get an argument going written out that's a biblical case for integralism, just to show it against the Christian anarchist types.
I think that's 100% needed, because a lot of the people who currently do integralism discussions are generally very Aristotelian-minded Thomists, and they're all great people and stuff, and I've learned a lot from them. But their arguments tend to focus on more of that second argument I gave, of looking at the nature of the state, man's two ends, and so on, and trying to argue that Catholicism as a religion basically almost fulfills what is lacking in natural philosophy. And they take basically this Aristotelian politics, and then in light of Christianity, you supernaturalize Aristotelian politics. And I think that's all right and correct and so on. But I think it's very incomplete. I think we have to look at protology and eschatology if we want to fully understand the purpose, right? Because we could also ask, why did maybe phrase it this way, right? We look at all these different nations in history. And if we look at the Tower of Babel, especially as it's interpreted by Moses in Deuteronomy 32, he talks about how at the Tower of Babel, essentially all the nations were just handed over to these other gods, to these demons. And I think then the mission of the church, in part, is that we are freeing the world from the demons. And so that's individual as well, right? When we do a baptism, we do exorcisms to cast out the demons from the person before we baptize them. But then there's also, I think, a sense of finally, once you've cast out the demons from the people in the society, you finally cast down the demons who run the society, and you take it back over.
Very true. Connor, quick rundown on localism, or real quick, everyone. Distributism, we call it localism. You gotta get that out of the way.
I am way less intelligent than Gideon, so don't expect my answer to be half as good as what he just gave about integralism. But localism is the political and economic thought of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, among others, that they at the time called distributism, like Caleb just explained. There's been a movement from guys like Dale Ahlquist today. In fact, he even has a book reclaiming the name of it, to localism, because at the end of the day, it really is just trying to have everything done at a local level. It comes from Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, and it's trying to, as Dale Ahlquist says, come home to Catholic social teaching. The reason localism takes on the name in place of distributism is that distributism is an awful name. It particularly inspires fear in your average American. And then localism, on the flip side, emphasizes the principle of subsidiarity found within the concept, and it really just is the concept. Chesterton described them as Hudge and Gudge, I think he called them. Basically, were the criticisms of monopoly enclosing from government power and monopoly enclosing from the capitalist corporate power. He thought those were the two biggest enemies to society, and because it's mostly Chesterton and Belloc's just pipe conversations and whatnot, you don't have a totally thought out idea of what it is, but the general push is for local communities, a more push for the agrarian or rural style of culture. In fact, Pope Pius XII had something he had written on rural and agrarian culture. I can't remember what it was called. I read about it this morning, but it was pushing for rural culture, and that's very popular among localists. It's basically making the family the central political point and making the community revolve around the family, and from that being your society. It makes a lot of sense with integralism as our roundtable, because both of them are just trying to put Catholic teaching at the first foot in how we build society.
Yeah, that's actually the point I wanted to make, is that neither of these really are political ideologies. They're more just proper exercising of Catholic social teaching applied to the political world. They're not really full-fledged ideologies that have fall to like the ideological traps that Burnham would write about. They are just implementing Catholic social teaching either nationally or locally, which I think is what makes these both so unique and interesting and useful for everybody.
Yeah.
So, okay. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's true that it's not ideological, because I think one of the things that makes it really difficult for liberals to wrap their, I mean liberal here in like the classical sense of the word, to wrap their head around integralism is that it's not neutral with regard to sides, right? So you'll often hear this argument of, oh, well, why don't you want to go live among the Taliban or something like that, right? But obviously, if we think that Catholicism is true and Islam is false, then they're actually, even if, let's say, I don't think an integralist society would actually, in practice, have all the exact same laws as the Taliban, but even if in theory it were to, right, they would still be fundamentally different because we're not neutral with regard to which religion it is. And I'll often hear then complaints from, I think this complaint makes sense from a secular liberal, but doesn't make sense from a Catholic liberal, is, oh, well, you wouldn't want it if the other side was in charge. It's like, yeah, because we think that the Catholic faith is actually true and actually does convey grace necessarily by fact of the covenant that God has made with the church. In such a way that it would not be the case. So God obviously gives grace to all people. There's a common grace given to everyone. But God has specifically promised, in fact, to work with us through the Catholic Church. And so it wouldn't make, we don't just set this up as equal. It's not ideological. And it connects to what I was saying earlier with, it is a real difference if Jesus runs your country or if a demon runs your country. It's not just policies. And among integralists, then, there could be very different views on policies. You know, before we went on, we were talking briefly about integralism within Catholic academia. And it actually was very popular for a few years in Catholic academia, at least in terms of the discourse. But it's sort of fallen away, I think, in large part because once we all agreed on this is the right way to be thinking about politics, there was then a lot of disagreement about what actual policy looks like. Because I don't think integralism, it doesn't give you an economic policy. It doesn't give you here's how your judicial system should work, or it doesn't tell you whether you should have a large or a small bureaucracy. And so these sorts of questions, which are very important, are distinct from, I think, this essence of integralism. And that's more the thing localism would take up then, it seems.
I was going to say that. Sitting here with my Chesterton profile picture, I'm ready to say small.
That is like one interesting points about both of these ways of thinking, integralism and localism, is that every modern political ideology, at least in the Americas, we've internalized the idea that the government has to be for everybody because of democracy. And in a sense, the government does have to be for its people. But when you have these giant multicultural societies, you inherently assume, well, if government's for everyone, they can't make certain claims or it can't make certain truth claims because it has to be for everybody. It doesn't recognize all truth claims. And integralism and localism kind of sidesteps that. Goes, no, we're just saying here's what the institutions should look like in practice. And in localism, like, no, I don't really. You can make your argument from truth claims wherever you are, but wherever I'm at, this is the truth claim here. We're going to make it this community. And so it kind of sidesteps that issue entirely, which I think is interesting about the two ideas. So when it comes to localism and integralism, on a local level, what is we're localists. Gideon, what does integralism look like on the local level? Does that mean like the priest is involved in local politics, like a priest is an advisor or something? Like, what does integralism look like locally speaking? Is there anything about that? Or
Yeah, I think it can vary quite a bit depending on the local region. So I don't think you would necessarily want the priest directly involved in local politics, right? But there is an idea we have of subsidiarity. And subsidiarity, to be clear, I think this is often misunderstood. It's not that everyone should do everything on a local level, but that everything should be done on the most local level possible. And so there's many things then we would hold that there could not be done on such a level. And there's also the subsidiarity comes from the Latin subsidium, which means help. So part of the role of the higher levels then is actually to help the lower levels properly fulfill their functions. And so we would want, right, at a local level, we have some sort of leader, whether it be elected or some hereditary position or however else it works. There's not, within integralism, we're very open to different forms of political government. That's going to be up to the particular customs of each area. But I think you would probably see the church play an important advisory role, right? So you might want someone important among the priests to perhaps serve as a spiritual advisor to the ruler of the area to ensure that the common good is being taken care of.
Well, and then on top of that, you mentioned the comment about, like, would the priest have that role locally? Would the priest be running local politics? And Chesterton was actually very opposed to that. He showed it a lot through his character, Father Brown. Father Brown says time and time again that he is opposed to such a thing, which of course is just Chesterton speaking through that character. He would much more prefer something like Gideon said, where Father Brown is the spiritual advisor in that locality, much more rather than a priest taking on that actual political role.
So what is the so when it comes to arguing for like localism around in your community, that's very easy. You know, it's just like, hey, I think money should stay locally. I think jobs should stay locally. It's very easy to make those arguments. How does one even begin to argue for integralism? Is it kind of relegate only to academic spheres, Gideon? Like, how does one even begin to make pushes towards an integralist worldview or style and word?
Yeah, I think there's already sort of fancy academic arguments and stuff for it. I think probably developing more the biblical arguments for it would probably be helpful on a more local pastoral level. Now, I also think part of it, though, is that there are some people who think that you should sort of take over and make the society integralist. But I think more integralism comes as a fruit of evangelizing a large percentage of the people. And part of it also is just evangelizing the ruler. So you would expect the ruler of any society to be very well educated. And so you would want missionaries to go to the ruler. And I think integralism, another argument you can make for it is, what do you do when the ruler converts, right? So this was sort of the practical consideration that came up in the 4th century. A lot of people will say, oh, well, God never promised a figure like Constantine to come. And I do think scripture says that there will be figures like that. But regardless, if you think God never prophesied it, it in fact happened, right? Integralism happened, regardless of whether or not you'd like it to. And so you have then the question of, you are the highest bishop in the country. You have just now converted the ruler of your country. How do you advise them, right? Do you advise them to step down and say Christians can't be involved in politics? Well, then I think you'd actually be calling on that ruler to do something very unjust in his duties. What you should do is encourage him then to rule in a Christian way. And that's simply going to have to be what happens.
Well, and on top of it, you gotta, just thinking out loud, Catholics as just average people who are calling for their leaders and whatnot need to be an actual voting bloc. Like, no one caters to a Catholic voting bloc, and no one there was no anti-Catholic propaganda when Joe Biden ran for president, because 1, he's not really Catholic, and 2, Catholics don't really care. Like, Catholics need to call for their leaders to actually do Catholic things when they are their leaders.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a big issue with the way we've come to talk about Catholic social teaching, is that we talk about it like this is a list of policies that will help the society. And that's true. There are a list of policies that the church encourages that would help the society. But I think first and foremost, we're trying to look for the sort of society that will rightly order itself towards God, both on a natural and supernatural level. And so I think there has to be in part a call by the bishops for the state to renounce its idolatry. And this is something I think the bishops need to wake up to, is that the bishops have decided that we want to get along with the society and that we can best influence things if we don't call for them to repent of their idolatry. But you look at a figure like Daniel in scripture, he's constantly calling on Nebuchadnezzar to repent of his idolatry. And he's also one of the highest ranking officials in the Babylonian government at the same time. So I don't think those two are necessarily opposed to one another even.
No, there's when it comes to localism when it comes to localism, one of the things I really appreciate about Chesterton and Belloc's writings on it is that it seems most of when it comes to how to put this, it seems like 85% of Belloc's political solutions is just to convert everybody to the same religion, and one of the purposes of localism is make it easier to have these conversations to convert locally. To create a society that makes it easier for conversion. That's the one I'm looking for here. Has brought it up once. Makes conversion readily accessible. Where it's normalized, where it's like, oh yeah, this keeps converting to Catholicism. Everyone else is too. Like the point of the, and same with integralism, it kind of enforces we want to create a Catholic culture that makes conversion easier, and localism, integralism are ways to make that Catholic culture prevalent.
Yeah, I was reading. It's not Dale Elquist's book. I'm calling it Dale Elquist's book because he edited it, but it's a bunch of people's book, Localism, this morning, and I just picked it up. But I was reading the second chapter, and it's all about returning to an agrarian style of life. And he says, all these people get excited about, localism and agrarian ideas, and they move to Idaho and start a farm. He goes, you've missed the point of localism. The point of localism isn't that you're going to go have a farm. The reason they like you having a farm, they like you doing that, is because of the way it prioritizes a family. When you have a farm, it's good for your family. He said, if your farming is bad for your family, then you've done the wrong thing already. And localism really centralizes the family as what it's trying to make it's trying to make a world where it's easiest to have a family. And when you have that family, it is important to you, and it is easy to grow that family because of exactly what you said. The family is good for that. And the goal of localism is not that you have a farm. The goal of that farm or of that local community or whatever you picture localism as, the goal is what's good for families and what's good for conversion, and whatever word has had that neither of us know because we're illiterate.
Giddy, any comments on that? Or?
As to your point about it being localism encouraging, right, conversion, is that I think if you look back at the Middle Ages, right, it's obviously not the case that everyone was a good, faithful, practicing Catholic. I mean, you can just go read writings from that time, and that's obviously not the case. Yeah. But I think there's something interesting to having the church at the center of the town. Because when the church is at the center of the town, it's sort of like exactly where you're supposed to go if you want to repent of your sinful life. Right? It's like it's right there for you. Versus when you have it now, there's not a clear place to go of where you are supposed to go for the truth. Now you have to spend all this time seeking. Versus it's right there, obviously, in a local society. I do think there can be. I think we have to distinguish here localism as a set of political prescriptions, because I think there can also be a sense in which we start constantly thinking about the ideal local society, and then we don't actually influence the local society around us. And I think this comes from how we think about politics, right? Nowadays, we think that being politically involved means that you go once every 2 or 4 years to a voting booth and you cast a vote for a few people. Versus the word politics, it comes from Aristotle, and he's referring to the polis, the city. So politics is your participation in the city. So when you go and you maybe build something local, you start a local store, whatever you do that's involved in your community, even getting very involved in your parish community, in some sense, that's political action because you're helping the health of your local polis.
Yeah, in Chesterton's Outline of Sanity, when he's describing like how one could be he says distributist because we hadn't gotten the word localist yet. He says that the whole goal, like we've talked about a couple times here, it's not that thought out or not that written out. The whole goal is just to stop the encircling movement of the corporations and the encircling movement of the government. He said, if you can just have one local institution, that stops the encircling movement from closing. So one of the political actions he recommends is just to be a regular at a local mom and pop shop, because like you say, that is engaging in your locality. That is where politics comes from. And he said, look, if you're just going to your mom and pop hardware store on the weekends, that's stopping the circle from completing. That's giving you one local thing to cling to. So that was literally one of his prescriptions, was exactly that, not looking at it the way we do, but instead just being involved in your community.
Well, I'm out of notes already.
Wow, we suck at this.
Well, it wasn't a...
I know.
Yeah, I guess I can raise one possible concern I sometimes have with the way people talk about localism, is that there can sometimes be, I think, an overemphasis on the local, and I think sometimes a sort of misrepresentation of subsidiarity to be about only everything has to happen on a local level, and that's not at all the case. I think this is a very American reception of this distributist idea, where we read in a very American localist ideal to it. But if you look at I think how the Catholic Church itself operates, the Catholic Church is an extremely global organization. I think this is something that American Catholics miss a lot. The first time I went over to a theology conference in Europe, it was mostly European priests there. And I sort of had this realization that in the American church, we tend to think the world revolves around the American church, but like the European church really doesn't care that much what happens in the American church. We're really our own separate sort of world. And that's the case for lots of different parts of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church recognizes this very global reality. And I think that's something important to notice.
Yeah, I actually, on Caleb's Substack, I actually have a little thing I wrote making that exact point. I think it was called Localism and Subsidiarity or something, where I pointed out that subsidiarity is exactly what you said. It's not just that everything has to be super duper small, but it's that everything is done at the level appropriate to it. And the staunchest localists will push for everything and it always being exclusively local. But on our Explain to Me Like I'm Five, I kind of complained about that because I do think there are things that localism doesn't answer when you look at it just that way. So I complained about that both on our Explain to Me Like I'm Five episode and on Caleb's Substack. If you want to check out either of those, both listeners.
Yeah, but that's one thing I was thinking about when you guys were talking about the when the hardcore localist types argue for everything done at the smallest possible level. It kind of ends up sounding like the anarchists who want to make everything privatized to the smallest local level, whereas like they completely ignore widespread issues like happening on a higher level. Like you can have a local stop to abortion, but you can't have a national solution only on local level. It has to be some higher level steps taken. And I think that's when these strict localists make the argument that everything has to be done only at the local level and nothing bigger, you end up sounding like the anarchists, which is Quentin's.
Yeah, I think a big issue here is that we as modern people tend to really lack humility, right? So we think that we at our local level have to have the solutions to every world problem. And I think one of the good things about localism is it makes us recognize that that's not the case, and that we have to humble ourselves and that we can't solve all the world's problems. We have real duties that exist to those who actually exist around us. But at the same time, I also think that there can sort of be another prideful thing where we just make everything about the local, and we don't think about how our local community itself needs to be humble and recognize that it's a small part of a much larger thing. I think just taking a look right online at how many Catholic bishops there are in the world can help you think about this, because all of a sudden you'll see that the church is much, much larger than we tend to imagine it. And then we're not even bishops, let alone even priests, right? We don't have any jurisdiction whatsoever within the church. And so we have our duties to our small local area, and that's what we need to be focusing on. While also recognizing then how our small part might fit into the more universal common good of the whole world.
Yeah, well, and you talk about like the pride we generally have, and Caleb mentioned the abortion issue. The perfect example of what you said. Imagine how prideful it would be if you stopped abortion, not you, but your community stopped abortion. So your little hometown doesn't have abortion anymore. And then you're like, well, fight's over. Have a nice day. And there was mass child slaughter one town over. I mean, obviously something needs to be done beyond the local when you look at something like that. And yes, you owe it to your community to stop that, but it would also be incredibly prideful to act as if your community were the only thing that mattered in that issue.
But when it comes to both these ideas, how do I put this? There are a lot of Catholics who either go the Catholic for choice route types, or the like the BoomerCon Kennedy Catholics, or then you have like the Michael Knowles conservative TradCon Catholics. What do you think it is that these ideas aren't as popular? Is this it's not being pushed enough? Is not enough people representing them? Did people just not know about them? Like, why do you think there's so many young Catholic people who just go the Goipo route, or go the TradCon route, or the super liberal route? Like, why do these ideas have more staying power?
I will say, in Michael Knowles' defense, it's pretty clear, I think, that Michael Knowles is an integralist. If you watch enough of his stuff, I don't agree with all of his politics. I think he has some bad takes on some issues, and I think most people, or I think, tend to have some bad takes on some issues. And that's why I really don't ally myself with any of these big political movements, because all of a sudden you have to start downplaying where your own views are if they don't fit in with what that group is. But no, I do think there's an issue in all of these movements generally where we say integralism and some additional ideology, right? And because it is the case, I think, that integralism is underdeterminative of what your political society ought to look like. But I think also at the same time, right now, we're not having those other discussions. It's the question of priorities. And I think the priority right now for the church should be to sort of re-recognize what the church is. The church is what Christ has established to exercise his rule over this world. And that the church it's not simply another voluntary society among other voluntary societies. It's not a club, but rather it is the way that God has instituted among men for the possibility of supernatural worship and for the possibility of the salvation of souls. And so I think part of integralism then is recognizing how does all of that apply to the political, while perhaps there might be disagreements in other areas. There's a while ago, I had this sort of realization, because I've met up with some of the like Catholic worker type people who I think are very much looked down upon in a lot of right-wing Catholic circles. Because there will be people in the Catholic workers movement who are like heretics and stuff. But there's other people who I think, just like you might see someone like either Michael Knowles or some sort of Groiper type sort of evangelizing in their right-wing sphere. You would also see, I think, these people who are faithful Catholics who are sort of evangelizing among the left. And I almost thought for a little while, like, we would be undefeated.
Something just came up on my end. I actually have to go right now. I am incredibly sorry. Hope you guys have a good one. I'm sorry I could only offer 30 minutes. God bless you both.
It was a good discussion. No, thank you. Yeah, I'd almost thought, like, if, let's say, the Groipers and the Catholic workers all got together, that there would sort of be like an undefeatable alliance here. But then I think both sides end up prioritizing other issues beyond the faith. They get into personality disputes or all sorts of other things. So I guess I've sort of lost hope in just uniting everyone together as a general integralist things. I think we almost all have to give up our own personal political things, whatever we might think is more important, or at least be willing to tolerate people with different opinions on the matter, and it's almost now become other issues that have now taken over as the primary discussions, things of debate, right? So you'll see over on the left, there will be almost an over prioritization of, we have to distance ourselves from Trump, or anything that looks bad on the right. We have to sort of downplay church teaching, perhaps, around gender and sexuality, because that might offend people. Whereas you have over on the right nowadays, there's sort of overemphasis on issues like immigration or foreign policy or things like that. Not to say those aren't important issues, but there has to be a question of what is the main things that we have to focus are the primary issues, or rather, what is it that we're sort of identifying as together as Catholics as a whole? People will sort of tie in their own favorite contemporary issue. Oftentimes, those other contemporary issues are important issues to talk about. I guess, does that make sense? Is over prioritization and the wrong ordering of things, or at the very least, the wrong disowning people. You know, we had this whole idea of no enemies to the right. It should almost, I feel like, be like no enemies within the church.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. I don't know if you've seen him on Twitter or not. There's a guy who's like a Catholic Leninist. He has a few bad takes, but I like the idea of, obviously I want everyone to agree with me because I'm prideful like that, but I do like the idea of these like Dorsey Day types who are just like inside these leftist circles evangelizing the other leftists in the same way these they are like the Catholic types who are evangelizing in the right wing circles. I do like this idea of having a united Catholic bloc on both sides, kind of saying, you know, no enemies in the church. I want to ask you a question about integralism real quick, though. You did a video a while ago. I think it was called like towards a Scotus integralism.
Yeah.
What is the difference between like a traditional, like, I don't know, Thomist integralist and a Scotus integralist? I know there are arguments whether or not Thomas Aquinas was an integralist or not, but I think you could make a case he was, if you would call it that at the time. You probably wouldn't. But what is the difference here between like Scotus and Thomist integralism?
Yeah, I was just trying to work out in that video how we might apply certain Scotus principles to argue for integralism. Like, I think one of the key points would sort of be this emphasis. So St. Thomas, if you look at the structure of the Summa, and even how he thinks about the role of Christ in the cosmos, for St. Thomas, he prioritizes Christ as Redeemer from sin. And so there's this idea for St. Thomas that you have this natural ordering of the world, and then Christ comes and raises up the natural to the supernatural. That's how you see generally Thomist integralist types arguing for it. Versus what I wanted to argue is that for Scotus, he sort of reverses it, where instead of, yes, Christ comes for us, but we are also for Christ. And actually the whole purpose of the cosmos is for Christ. And so I wanted to then argue that the political ultimately is for the sake of Christ. I also had some other things as well. So like discussing how Scotus has this distinction between willing the good for its own sake and willing the good for our own sake. So we ought to will the good for our own sake. This is what Scotus calls, and he draws this from St. Anselm, the affectio commode. But he also has the idea of the affectio justitiae, that we will the good simply because it is good. And that actually has to be the most important sense of the good. So he draws this actually from St. Anselm's dialogue on the fall of the devil, because St. Anselm argues that fundamentally what Satan does is that he wills happiness, but he wills happiness for himself apart from its larger role within the good. So he wills happiness apart from the good. And so actually this ends up making Satan the most miserable of creatures. But essentially it's not, we ought to love ourselves. And we ought to even to love ourselves more than we love other people. But we ought to love God more than we love ourselves. And even when we love ourselves, we ought to love ourselves for the sake of our goodness, rather than merely for the sake of ourselves. That makes sense, right? You can love yourself because it is what is good to love yourself. And you can love yourself simply because you have this self-ordinate or inordinate vanity. And so I think you can then apply this to the political for a strong defense of the priority of the common good. And especially with Scotus, he prioritizes the will over the intellect. And some people say, all right, this leads to sort of an arbitrary willing. And I think that is just a misunderstanding of Scotus. That's what you get in Occam. It was a similar psychology to Scotus, but it's within a very different context. And so you end up with some very problematic things in Occam. But I think fundamentally within Scotus, if we view ourselves primarily as willing creatures rather than intellectual creatures. And for Scotus, the beatific vision is primarily about loving God, versus for St. Thomas, it's primarily about knowing God. And so I think, for example, if you think about the Scotist vision of the beatific vision, it's much more of a communal approach. So for St. Thomas, God is the common good of heaven because he is the common intellectual object of all of our enjoyment. Versus for Scotus, it's because he's the common object of our love. So there's this great communion of love within heaven. And so I think then we can view politics as essentially ordering ourselves towards this communion of love.
I do like that idea. I've always been, when it comes to any kind of political idea, my metric for it is, okay, we are meant to, how do I put this? Love is willing to good for the other. God loved the world into creation by willing to good for it. We should be, every political activity it takes to be kind of built around this ethic of love. Okay, so the point is to be pursuing the common good, therefore to be willing to good. Is this policy going to make it easier, or is the policy itself willing to good towards those it would affect? If it's not, then it's a bad policy. And I think that's kind of like a bare minimum metric someone can have for determining a good or bad political policy. But so, okay, because I'm going to derail this a little bit here because I'm curious on this whole SCOTUS thing. The emphasis on you say it was emphasis on the will over the intellect.
Yeah,
you said, what is the? I never had this explained to me. What exactly is the difference here? Because when it comes to like the inner workings of the mind and the will and that kind of stuff, I'm completely ignorant to it. So, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so essentially the intellect, right, is that by which we're able to think and know things. And the will is that by which we're able to desire and choose things. And so I think both Thomas and Scotus are going to be trying to draw out a middle ground in it, because you'll find, for example, a lot of Platonists will be very strict intellectualists, so strongly emphasizing the intellect. And so if you look, for example, in Plato himself, Plato thinks that the only reason that anyone does evil actions is because they either are uneducated or too stupid to choose what's good. That it's ultimately an intellectual error that makes people choose evil. And Plato's argument for this is that if we know the good, right, we ought to choose the good. It's irrational to will evil, because even if you will evil, it's ultimately harmful even to yourself. And so it doesn't make any sense to will evil if you think it out rationally. And so Plato is going to say, well, there must be some intellectual error somewhere along the way. So it's sort of, I think, an overemphasis on the intellectuals. I think ultimately then you're going to run into a serious issue with how can mortal sin exist, because fundamentally that it's impossible to commit a mortal sin with full knowledge and full consent of it. If this is the case, you're also going to end up with serious issues on the divine level, because it's a dogma of the church taught at Vatican I that God could have willed the world differently or could have not willed the world at all. But if God simply wills the world on account of his intellectual knowledge of its goodness, then there could be no other way that God could have chosen, because this simply has to be the best. You find this, for example,
that's what possible was kind of saying.
Yeah, exactly. So Leibniz thinks that this has to be the best of all possible worlds, because God wills nothing less than the best. So you have that as sort of one extreme. You could then have the other possible extreme. You get in someone like William of Ockham, where for Ockham, the will is essentially arbitrary. So yes, we can think about things rationally and stuff, but there's really no ultimate determination that our rationality will have towards our will whatsoever. And this is going to become very, very problematic when we then think about the divine will, especially. So Ockham would say that we're bound to will certain things on a human level, but it's simply on account of what God has willed for us. And God's will binds our will. But there's fundamentally no reason of goodness that God wills one thing rather than another. So Ockham will go so far as to say that God could command us to hate him. God could command us to choose what seems to be evil.
It sounds like
simply because God wills it.
It sounds like that divine command series some Protestants and Muslims practice.
Exactly.
But I've never been able to wrap my head around how anyone finds that rational.
Exactly. So Ockham has a very strict thing. Essentially, what is good is simply what God wills. Because the will has to be all extremely above the intellect, essentially.
Hmm.
So you end up with this basically arbitrary God. So the middle ground that both Thomas and Scotus are trying to carve out is that we clearly want a room for human freedom, but we also want a place where that freedom is not an arbitrary willing. So Thomas will place the emphasis primarily on the intellect. And I've never actually fully understood what the actual Thomist position is. And I've spoken to a lot of different Thomists on this and gotten different answers. Because it seems to me that Thomas is almost sort of going in circles, that he wants to say ultimately what the will is going to will is based on the deliberation of the intellect. But the intellect can't ultimately force the will, because if it were, then there would be ultimately no freedom. And I think you almost, in certain texts of Thomas, it feels like you're going to end up in this infinite regress here. Versus I think Scotus offers a very satisfying and clear solution, which is simply that, yeah, the will is able to choose between alternative options. So we are able to simply will evil if we desire to will evil. God is able to will the world to be different. But goodness is still something objective. Scotus is a very strong realist in terms of metaphysics, versus Occam is a nominalist. So Occam thinks to these nominalists that things are ultimately good because we call them good, versus Scotus thinks things are good because they're in line with being, because being is a transcendental property, or goodness rather is a transcendental property of being. And so there is objective goodness and evil. And it's not simply arbitrary, even if there might be a certain degree of arbitrariness within our choices because we're able to choose otherwise.
Okay, well, one of up on our time here, so I have one more question on the integralist front. Earlier we talked about, United Catholic Bloc trying to push for these Catholic codes so that would make these ideas more prevalent and easily implemented. If the goal of the integralists is to have this integralist system in place where the papacy and the church is it's serving its proper role, can we have allies in the Orthodox with the Eastern Orthodox, or is that kind of like does this focus of wanting to put the Catholic Church in what we believe to be its proper role go against what the Orthodox would want? So is it possible to have allies with the Eastern Orthodox on this matter, or? Because I know there are some Eastern Orthodox people who really despise integralism.
Yeah. So I think that, maybe I'll start with sort of what the situation was like before Vatican II and where I actually think Vatican II has helpfully developed things here.
Okay.
Because before Vatican II, right, there was already a distinction between natural religion and supernatural religion. So in a sense, if one was an unbaptized monotheist, the church really couldn't do anything to restrict their religious freedom. So the papacy actually interceded many times to defend the religious rights of Jews. Since the Jews were unbaptized, they weren't under the obligation of the church. And they were worshiping monotheistically, so they weren't violating natural religion either. So since they weren't practicing supernatural religion in the eyes of the church, and they were properly practicing natural religion, the church felt perhaps if they were contrary to the common good, right? So this is where things became a bit more complicated with Islam. As you've spoken about many times in the podcast, right? There's many ways in which having a large Muslim population in your society can actually be harmful to the common good. But if you have a group of Muslims that are getting along, they're being good citizens, they're not causing any issues, there's nothing the state ought to do to restrict the rights of those Muslims to practice their Islamic faith, because they're only within the realm of natural religion. Where things got more complicated historically was with the baptized who weren't Catholic, and perhaps were never Catholic. Because if they were baptized, even if they had never practiced the Catholic faith, in the eyes of the church, they were members of the church. So if you were Orthodox or a Protestant, essentially what you really were in the eyes of the church was a bad Catholic. Versus what you sort of have in Lumen Gentium at Vatican II is a recognition that, yes, they stand in some sort of relation to the church. But as distinct in the case of the Orthodox, we refer to them as churches because they have bishops. In the case of Protestants, refer to them as ecclesial communities because they're baptized, they're Christian communities, but they aren't churches because they have no bishops. And there is historical precedent for this. So the way we actually, I think, in practice, always treated the Orthodox when we would have reunion councils or so on, is we treated them like they were distinct churches. We always have recognized their sacraments. That's never been an issue. And so I think at Vatican II, sort of a recognition, I think, that in the past, if someone was a Protestant or around the time of the schism, if they were Orthodox, they were doing so in an intentional rebellion against the church, versus your average Protestant or Orthodox today is not doing so in a rebellion against the church. They're doing so because they're seeking to faithfully follow Christ in where they are, and they've never been Catholic. There's not large Catholics in their land or anything. And so I think this is a recognition. This is not merely, so people say, oh, this is Vatican II changed things. Like, no, there is precedent for this. And if you now look in the Code of Canon Law, the Code of Canon Law no longer treats Protestants or Orthodox as bad Catholics within the Code of Canon Law. So in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, if you were Lutheran or you were Orthodox or anything like that, you were actually bound to canon law. So if you were not fasting on Fridays, you were actually violating canon law, even if you were a Protestant and had never been Catholic, versus in the 1983 Code of Canon Law, that's actually no longer the case. You are not considered Catholic according to the Code of Canon Law. And I think that this, then you can see that if we had an integralist society, right, we would have to follow canon law. Canon law would regulate it. And by the way, canon law, even the 1983 code, it kind of actually assumes integralism. Like there are lots of rules in canon law for how things relate to the civil law of societies. And the church functionally treats itself like a sort of political community within the Code of Canon Law. There's lawyers of the Code of Canon Law, there's jurists and so on. The church is its own society within as canon law treats it. And so I think that if we had an integralist society, we'd be following now the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which would then guarantee the rights of Protestants and Orthodox according as the code states.
Yeah, because I'll be honest, when it comes to the Orthodox, I have friends who are Orthodox. I have honestly disagreements with them. I'm being Catholic. I still have a certain level of respect for them because I think aesthetically speaking, there's a lot of beauty there. When it comes to politically speaking, I have a hard time finding allies in the Orthodox circles. You think there would be more agreement, but when it comes to like a simple friend-enemy distinction for any Western Catholic is does this person hate the West? If they are anti-Western, they don't think they can count as friends. And I think there's a lot of Orthodox people who end up being not just anti-Catholic, but very anti-Western, anti-Western history, Western culture. And I don't think you can have allies with those kind of people. And so that's what I was wondering about when it came to making political moves going forward. How does a Catholic make a friend-enemy distinction properly? Is it just a friends only Catholic, enemies non-Catholic? It seems to be an issue of how do you classify friend-enemy distinction while still being in good standing with the Catholic Church?
Yeah, I think that an important thing to remember always is Schmidt is right with the friend-enemy distinction, but he's also deeply wrong about it another way, because there's not an equal ontological prioritization of friend and enemy. So Scotus, when he's discussing transcendentals, it's not a similar thing in Thomas. He will distinguish between simple properties of being and complex properties of being. So act and potency are complex properties of being, that all being is either in act or it's in potency. Whereas on the other hand, goodness is a simple property of being. So evil is not another mode of being. Evil is some lack of goodness that ought to be there. Whereas if something is potential being, it's better if it's actual being, but there's nothing bad about potential being. A potential being is good. So we look at friends and enemies. Enemies imply there's something evil involved there. And so enemies are not, it is not another mode of relations between a people. It's rather a lack of a relation that ought to be there, because the relation of friendship ought to be there between people. Friendship is a sub-virtue of justice. We have a duty to be friendly towards other people. And so if someone has made themselves an enemy, then it's because fundamentally they are opposing the virtue of friendship. And enmity is a vice here. And so then I think we have to look at to what degree it applies with different people. It's in different people, right? There's going to be various degrees to which they are fulfilling the virtue of friendship towards us. And I think that's just where we're going to have to consider things, right? Just because someone is outside the church doesn't mean that they lack. And there could also be those who are seemingly inside the church who in fact lack the natural virtue of friendship. Because once you introduce charity into things, then you sort of supernaturalize the virtue of friendship. So charity is going to allow you to have this supernatural form of friendship. And so those outside the church are going to be excluded from supernatural friendship. But that doesn't mean there is a lack of natural friendship.
That's interesting. I do like the idea. That's one thing when it came to like the foot enemy distinction. I'm like, yeah, if politics is doing good to your friends and harm to your enemy, how do you enemy makes a if politics is doing good to your friends and harm to your enemies, then we need to be very careful what we label enemies, because we don't want to do untoward harm to someone who is not deserving of harm. It'd be against justice.
Yeah, because Schmidt will say that when enmity ceases, there ceases to be politics. Versus in our view, I think we would say that politics is essentially about a common good, about sharing love with friends, versus politics is accidentally about harming enemies. But it's about harming enemies insofar as those enemies impede the essential goal of the common good.
Very interesting. I want to have you back on later, maybe for like a conversation on the Catholic take on foreign enemy distinction or something. That could be interesting.
Yeah. New Polity has written a number of articles critical of Schmidt that I think are good on this point. I've heard other people who know Schmidt better complain that they misrepresent Schmidt and stuff, but I've never been convinced that Schmidt doesn't ultimately fall into this very problematic issue. To draw an example, I think, though, right, you could look at how Schmidt served as an advisor in Nazi Germany, right? If I remember correctly, he gets divorced or something like that, and that's ultimately, well, I don't remember exactly what it is, but there's some reason that has nothing to do with his actual views that he ends up outside the Nazi party. But what Schmidt never does throughout his entire life is recant of his support of the Nazi party. And I think if you then look at, right, how do Hitler's politics operate? Hitler's politics essentially involve a continual making of new enemies, that there always has to be a scapegoating of some new enemy, because once there are no more enemies, once the Nazis defeat all their enemies, the purpose of the Nazi party will cease to be. So there has to be constant new enemies being generated, right? So even if Hitler had won World War II, and let's say he had managed to kill all the Jews and the Slavs and whoever he had there, he would have had to immediately invent a new enemy if he were to continue with his ideology, because that's simply the nature of the metaphysics behind Schmidt's worldview.
That's interesting to think about. Think about that more. I've never read Schmidt. I've only ever heard people talk about Schmidt. No, that's not true. I read I think it was political theology. I think I read that one, which is interesting. But I think that is something that's a common. I use the word danger for lack of a better word. And today is that there are the dissident right ideas and the neo-reaction ideas becoming more and more popular, and they seem to be a lot of Catholics who are going into that direction. And I'm all for it, because I think the traditional politics that we've had for the last 20 to 30 years has kind of been awful. But there is the elite series type of, removing oneself from politics, if you're in a Machiavellian sense, does open up a lot of problems. This is why some people like Peter Graves have had huge problems with Machiavelli and that entire removing oneself from the concrete to view it objectively. You get the same problems you have with science when you do that. Put the butterfly in the lab and only study it in the lab, you're going to miss things. In the same way, when you remove yourself from the situation at hand, you're going to miss things. So that's important. It needs to be covered and fixed.
I think one of the most problematic statements on sort of this new right is this emphasis on power. Right? We've very much come to emphasize power. I think there's a recognition that there's sort of this problematic thing in liberalism, where liberalism encourages intentionally giving up power even when it's given to you. And that's a problem. But I've also seen people ask, why? We'll say, right, we want to ban contraception. And they'll say, well, you think that's good. What makes it good? And you'll say, whoever has power decides it's good. Well, that's not correct at all. Right? Yeah. Obviously, if we have power, we can actually properly enforce the good. But the reason that we want power is to order things towards the good. And it's not primarily about having power. It's primarily about the good.
Yeah, a lot of this and right stuff is kind of it's postmodern right-wing stuff, and I there's a lot of good stuff in the postmodern people, like Jean-Jacques Lyotard is fantastic. Byung-Chul Han is another great example. They're all good. Deleuze is fun, but there is a problem that comes with this postmodern ideal that I think people are kind of not aware of, and that's something that I think Catholics need to make a push for in these circles. It's like, hey, yes, there's a lot of good stuff here. We still have to remember. It's about the common good. It's not just about power.
Yeah.
Well, we've run up on our time, Gideon. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've loved having you on. Love to have you on again sometime. Where can people find you at? Any final thoughts on localism, integralism, or anything else we talked about today?
No, I can't think of much else here. I guess I might end with a reminder that we could sometimes, I think, over-prioritize politics, that we are very critical of democracy, but we end up falling into the very trap of democracy, where democracy makes us think that the most important thing in the world is what we do once every 4 years, and especially now as we're going up into an election cycle. That's not to say there isn't anything important, right? Obviously, I'm very against this liberal idea that we ought to retreat from the political and that Christianity should have nothing to do with politics. That's very wrong. But we ultimately want to prioritize local actual good, right? We don't want to just be sitting around theoretically thinking of the good. We want to do actual good things around us. So don't make an overemphasis on politics stop you from doing things like actually like settling down, getting married and having kids, or actually joining your local parish community in various activities. And most importantly, also the primacy of the spiritual, that ultimately the reason that we want integralism is to orient the whole political community towards God. But we also ought to, we're not in any political positions, at least the two of us doing this. Perhaps if some politician stumbles across this video, you as a politician have a duty towards that. But neither of us are politicians. What we do have a duty over is we have a duty over our own spiritual lives. So we ought to be seeking the political good. Or if we want to encourage giving up the goods of this world and focusing on the spiritual good, we are to focus on prayer and fasting and so on. If we also have anyone we rule over, so I have children, and so I have a duty towards my children as well to orient them towards God, and simply realizing wherever we are in our own communities, our own states in life, to fulfill our station in life, because it's very easy in the modern world. I'm very guilty of this myself. I'm somewhat preaching to myself here as I'm saying this, is that we overemphasize well, this other person is failing to fulfill their station in life, therefore I don't have to fulfill my station in life. And that's not at all the case. We're ultimately all going to be judged on how we fulfilled our own individual stations in life, apart from any consideration of how anyone else fulfilled their station in life.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. Everyone listening, this will be the last podcast for a while. I will be making driving up to Alaska Tuesday, so I will be out of the podcast for a while. There might be some stuff coming out from Connor or from the other two guys, Bowdes and Louise. But yeah, everyone, thanks for listening. Gideon, thanks so much for coming on. You all have a good night, and God bless.
Just as the moon receives its light from the sun, so the royal power receives the splendor of its dignity from pontifical authority. Pope Innocent III